Imagine this. A check for $350,000 arrives at your doorstep. It's not a loan, it's not a gift, it's reparations, an attempt to restore what was lost. Payment for centuries of unpaid labor, for the generational wealth that was stolen, for the deep, unhealed scars that still run through the very fabric of a nation. But wait, where did this promise come from? Did Donald Trump, one of the most polarizing figures in modern politics, just pledge to pay Native African Americans $350,000 each? Is this real, or is it yet another headline designed to grab attention, to make us stop, to make us wonder? To understand if this is a reality or another fantastical story, we must first clarify who we're talking about. When we say Native African Americans, we are referring to the descendants of the enslaved, those whose ancestors endured unimaginable suffering, forced labor, and systemic oppression, whose lives were stolen, whose stories were erased, and whose wealth was stripped away, only to be passed on to others while their legacy was buried beneath the weight of history. This conversation is not just about numbers or promises. It's about a debt long overdue, a nation reckoning with its past, and the potential for healing or further division. Who is responsible for paying these reparations? How do we measure the value of a life lived in bondage and stripped of opportunity? And if such payments were to be made, would they truly restore what was lost, or merely offer a small comfort in the face of a much larger, more profound injustice? This isn't just a question of money. It's about power, history, and what it takes to right the wrongs of a society built on a foundation of inequality. If reparations were actually implemented, what would that mean for the future of race relations, wealth distribution, and social justice in America? Would it be enough to change the course of history? Or would it be yet another band-aid on a wound that refuses to heal? The real question is whether society is ready to face the uncomfortable truths about its past, and whether the people who have suffered the most are ready to accept whatever form of healing might come, or whether they'll continue to fight for the justice they have been denied for far too long. Men, women, and children uprooted, trafficked, and forced into servitude. These were the people whose blood, sweat, and tears built this nation. For over 400 years, they were denied their humanity. Their lives were reduced to mere labor, their identities erased by the brutality of slavery. When emancipation came, the promise of freedom wasn't followed by opportunity. Instead, it was met with violence, disenfranchisement, and systemic oppression. Even today, the economic divide between Native African Americans and the rest of the nation remains a haunting legacy, an ever-present gap that determines who thrives and who continues to struggle. This is why the issue of reparations has been such a long, painful, and divisive debate in the United States. It's not a new conversation. It began with promises like 40 acres and a mule made after the Civil War, a promise that was never honored. For generations, the discussion of reparations has been mired in morality, economics, and politics, resurfacing time and again as the country tries to reconcile its past with its present. So today, we're left asking, did Donald Trump truly promise $350,000 in reparations to Native African Americans? Could this claim be legitimate? Or is it just another twist in America's never-ending struggle with its history and its future? To answer these questions, we must first understand the context of reparations and where this conversation began. It starts with the transatlantic slave trade, a centuries-long system that uprooted millions of Africans from their homelands and subjected them to unimaginable horrors. Ships packed tight with human cargo crossed the Atlantic, carrying people who would have their names, their languages, and their cultures stripped away, all in the name of forced labor. For 246 years, slavery was the backbone of America's economic success, powered by the labor of Native African Americans, those whose ancestors were enslaved. These individuals labored in the fields, built the country's infrastructure, and contributed to the prosperity of a nation that, for centuries, refused to acknowledge their humanity. They were unpaid workers, their labor stolen, their generational wealth denied, their futures erased. After slavery ended in 1865, there was a brief moment of hope, a promise for something better. In that year, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which promised 40 acres of land and a mule to freed black families. This was meant to be the foundation upon which these families could build their own futures, a gesture of reparation for the years of suffering and exploitation. But that promise, like so many others, was never fulfilled. Instead, the land was taken back, and the cycle of disenfranchisement and economic disparity continued. The struggle for reparations has continued ever since. While various proposals have surfaced, none have ever come to fruition in a meaningful way. The moral and political debate rages on. Should America pay reparations? And if so, what form should they take? This brings us back to the question of Trump's alleged $350,000 promise. Is this a genuine attempt to right the wrongs of the past? Or is it just another headline designed to capture attention? To truly understand the gravity of reparations, we need to look beyond the headlines, beyond the promises and the rhetoric. We need to recognize the ongoing legacy of slavery and systemic oppression that continues to affect Native African Americans today. And we must ask ourselves, what does justice look like in a nation that has denied justice for so long? Reparations are not just about money. They are about acknowledging the deep wounds of the past, addressing the structural inequities that persist, and providing a pathway for healing that is long overdue. The question is, will America finally live up to its promises, or will the cycle of neglect continue? For many, it was the first glimmer of justice after centuries of enslavement, a promise that, for a moment, seemed to offer the possibility of restoring what was lost. But that hope was short-lived. When President Andrew Johnson reversed Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15 in 1865, the land was taken back, and the promise of 40 acres and a mule was snatched away, returned to Confederate landowners. Just like that, the dream of reparations evaporated. What followed was a series of failures that deepened the wounds of the nation. During Reconstruction, opportunities to repair the damage caused by slavery were abandoned. Freedmen, though no longer enslaved, were left landless, jobless, and at the mercy of oppressive systems like sharecropping, segregation, and the Jim Crow laws. These systems were specifically designed to prevent Black Americans from rising economically or socially, keeping them entrenched in a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. The ripple effect of that abandonment still resonates today, as the descendants of enslaved people continue to face the consequences of that unfulfilled promise. Despite the failures of the past, the conversation around reparations has never fully disappeared. In recent years, it has gained new momentum, led by advocacy groups like the National African American Reparations Commission, NARC, which is pushing for recognition, justice, and tangible compensation for the descendants of enslaved people. Across the country, some cities and states are beginning to take action. Evanston, Illinois, for instance, became the first city in America to fund reparations through a housing program, offering payments to Black residents as an attempt to address historical injustices. California is exploring statewide reparations initiatives, and other cities are beginning to study their roles in the legacy of slavery and systemic racism. While these efforts are a significant step, they are still only small gestures in the face of centuries of harm. The question remains, can America finally reckon with its past and fulfill the promises that have been delayed for generations? And what would reparations, such as a potential $350,000 per African American descendant of slavery, mean for the U.S. economy? Let's break it down. Today, the estimated population of African American descendants of enslaved people is around 40 million. If each individual were to receive $350,000 in reparations, the total cost would soar to a staggering $14 trillion. To put this into perspective, the current U.S. national debt stands at over $34 trillion, meaning this reparations program alone would account for nearly half of that, making it one of the largest financial undertakings in history. But that raises an important question. How would the government pay for it? One option could be to print more money, injecting trillions of dollars into the economy. However, economists warn that this could trigger catastrophic inflation, as an influx of money could chase too few goods, causing prices for housing, food, and gas to skyrocket. The purchasing power of every dollar could be drastically reduced, essentially wiping out the value of what was handed out in reparations. Another option would be to raise taxes. Such a massive program would likely require tax increases across the board, impacting individuals, corporations, and small businesses alike. The economic implications are far-reaching, and the country would need to grapple with how to finance a program of this magnitude without destabilizing the economy. As we consider the potential costs, we must also confront the moral and social implications of such a monumental step. What would it mean for America's future if it were to truly fulfill its debt to the descendants of those who were enslaved? Would this be a step toward true reconciliation, or would it deepen divisions, sparking further debates over fairness, equity, and responsibility? These are the questions that will shape the future of the reparations movement, and ultimately the nation itself. While some argue that taxing the wealthiest Americans more heavily could fund reparations, it remains a daunting challenge. Even if taxes on the rich were increased significantly, it would take decades, if not longer, to generate the trillions needed for such a monumental program. Politically, any significant tax hike would face fierce resistance, particularly from those who believe such a measure would undermine economic growth or punish success. The backlash could make it nearly impossible to pass legislation necessary to fund reparations. A third option might involve reallocating the federal budget. The United States spends over $800 billion annually on defense, and redirecting a portion of these funds toward reparations could, in theory, make the program financially feasible. However, this approach comes with its own set of trade-offs. Reducing military spending could prompt national security concerns, while cutbacks to other federal programs, such as infrastructure, education, or healthcare, could harm vital services that already rely heavily on government funding. Balancing these priorities would undoubtedly spark debates about how to best allocate resources in a nation already facing significant challenges in various sectors. So, is this level of reparations unprecedented? The answer, in a historical context, is no. There are precedents for large-scale reparative justice programs. After World War II, the U.S. government paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were unjustly forced into internment camps. Under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, each surviving internee received $20,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $50,000 today. While the payment was symbolically important, it fell short of fully compensating for the economic losses, emotional trauma, and devastation caused by the internment. On a larger international scale, Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors after World War II. Since 1952, Germany has distributed over $90 billion to survivors and their families. These payments were not merely financial. They served as a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a step toward reconciliation. Yet, despite the significance of these reparations, they pale in comparison to the scale of reparations needed for African Americans in the United States. Reparations for descendants of slavery present unique challenges. Unlike specific atrocities with a defined period, the legacy of slavery is systemic and generational. Its impact is deeply embedded in America's history, manifesting in housing discrimination, redlining, wealth inequality, and limited access to education and healthcare. These issues have compounded over generations, creating a persistent and entrenched divide between African Americans and the rest of the population. Experts argue that a $14 trillion reparations program would not simply involve writing checks to individuals. It would require a systemic overhaul, reforms designed to address the underlying causes of economic injustice and ensure long-term equity for African American families. Economists are divided on whether such a program is truly feasible. Some believe that direct reparations could significantly close the racial wealth gap in America, where the median black household holds just 1/10 of the wealth of the median white household. A financial boost of $350,000 per person would allow families to pay off debt, purchase homes, invest in education, and create generational wealth for the first time, possibly reversing decades, even centuries of economic disenfranchisement. But others argue that such a massive transfer of wealth could destabilize the economy. Concerns about inflation, the complexities of taxation, and the resistance to government spending would make implementation of a program of this magnitude extraordinarily difficult. Critics warn that the short-term economic boost could be wiped out by rising prices, interest rates, and the strain on public resources. The nation would have to weigh the long-term benefits of reparations against the potential economic risks, considering how such a program could reshape the American landscape for generations to come. Additionally, critics argue that without structural changes, reparations alone might not achieve the intended results. They point out that the influx of wealth could drive up housing prices or increase the cost of education, potentially negating the benefits of reparations. For example, if a significant portion of the African American population were suddenly given $350,000, there could be a surge in demand for housing or higher education, pushing costs beyond the reach of those who most need it. This could dilute the reparative effect, leaving the cycle of inequality largely intact. Yet, advocates assert that economic justice for African Americans is long overdue, and that these systemic issues cannot be resolved without substantial reparations. The wealth gap, rooted in centuries of stolen labor, stolen land, and systemic discrimination, will not close without meaningful financial redress. Proponents of reparations argue that $14 trillion, while a daunting figure, should not be viewed as an insurmountable burden. They remind us that America has always found the financial resources when it mattered. Whether funding wars, bailing out banks during the financial crisis, or providing relief during the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. government has managed to marshal large sums of money in response to crises. If the nation can summon the will to act in those instances, advocates argue, it can also find a way to invest in the future of African Americans, addressing the profound injustices of the past. What would $350,000 in reparations mean for the economy? It's a complex equation, fraught with challenges and trade-offs. However, one thing is clear: reparations are not merely an economic question. They are a moral one, an issue of justice, aimed at restoring the dignity of those whose ancestors built this nation through forced labor, without any reward or recognition. The cost of reparations might be high, but the cost of inaction, allowing the inequality that has persisted for centuries to continue, could be even higher. To understand the true significance of reparations today, we must look at the generational wealth gap. Wealth in America is passed down not just through income, but through assets, land, homes, businesses, and investments. For white families, this transfer of wealth has been largely uninterrupted, with inheritances and property passed from one generation to the next. But for African Americans, this process has been systematically blocked at nearly every stage of history. Slavery, of course, stripped black families of any opportunity to accumulate wealth. When emancipation came, it offered freedom, but with no land, no money, and no resources to build a future. During Reconstruction, there was hope for redemption with promises like 40 acres and a mule, but those promises were quickly rescinded when President Andrew Johnson reversed the order and returned land to Confederate owners. Then came the Jim Crow era, segregation, redlining, and discriminatory policies that excluded African Americans from opportunities to build wealth through home ownership, business loans, and access to quality education. By the time the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the damage was already done, and African Americans had been denied access to the financial systems that would allow them to thrive. Today, the median wealth of a white household is nearly 10 times that of a black household. White families have homes, inheritances, and investments to pass on to future generations, while many African American families are still grappling with the effects of being locked out of these opportunities. This isn't just a wealth gap. It's a chasm created by centuries of exclusion, and it continues to shape who has access to economic opportunity in America. The socioeconomic impact of slavery and its enduring legacy is still visible today. The inability of African Americans to build wealth for generations has left them vulnerable to poverty, unemployment, and limited opportunities. The wealth gap perpetuates systemic disparities in healthcare, education, housing, and even life expectancy. It's not simply a financial disparity, it's a societal one, deeply woven into the fabric of American life. Reparations, then, are not just about addressing a historical wrong. They are about providing a future for millions who have been systematically denied the chance to rise. The challenge now is whether America is willing to face its past and finally begin the long overdue process of healing and justice. In housing, Black Americans face higher rates of eviction and lower rates of homeownership, which leaves them unable to build wealth through property. In education, underfunded schools in majority Black neighborhoods often struggle to provide the necessary resources and opportunities for students to succeed. In healthcare, Black communities suffer from worse outcomes, higher mortality rates, and limited access to quality care. In the criminal justice system, African Americans are disproportionately policed, incarcerated, and marginalized. These aren't isolated incidents. They are part of a broader system that has worked for centuries to create barriers for African Americans, a system that, for many, still feels impossible to overcome. Supporters of reparations argue that addressing these disparities is both a moral and economic necessity. Morally, reparations are about acknowledging the harm caused by slavery and the systems of oppression that followed. They are about restoring the dignity of a people who were dehumanized, exploited, and forced to labor for the prosperity of a nation. Economically, reparations could help close the wealth gap, providing Black families with the resources needed to build businesses, own homes, invest in their futures, and break free from the cycle of poverty that has persisted for generations. Advocates believe reparations aren't charity, they're justice. Justice for the unpaid labor that helped build America's economy. Justice for the land stolen, the lives lost, and the opportunities denied. Without reparations, they argue, America cannot claim to have truly reckoned with its past. Critics, however, raise significant concerns. They argue that the cost would be astronomical, trillions of dollars that would need to be funded by taxpayers. They question how such a program would be implemented, who qualifies, and how ancestry could be traced in a way that is fair and accurate. They wonder whether direct payments could truly solve the systemic inequality that continues to affect Black Americans, or whether they might create new tensions and divisions in society. Some opponents also believe reparations would be unfair to those who never participated in slavery or systemic oppression, asking why today's generation should be held responsible for the sins of the past. While this argument resonates with some, supporters counter that the benefits of slavery didn't end with emancipation. They argue that the wealth, power, and privilege generated by slavery are still deeply embedded in America's wealth and institutions, continuing to benefit many while disadvantaging Black Americans. Beyond the debates and policy discussions, there are real people whose lives have been shaped by this legacy. People like Mary, a mother of 3 who works 2 jobs just to make ends meet. Her grandparents were sharecroppers, denied the ability to own the land they worked. Her parents faced redlining, which forced them into neighborhoods with underfunded schools and little investment. Now Mary dreams of sending her children to college, but without generational wealth, she struggles to save. I just want my children to have what other families take for granted, she says. Consider James, a small business owner whose grandfather fought in World War II. While white veterans returned home and received low-interest loans, education benefits, and housing support through the GI Bill, Black veterans like James' grandfather were excluded from those programs. The opportunities his family missed out on have left James starting from zero, trying to build what others inherited. These stories are not isolated. They reflect a shared history that continues to shape the lives of millions of African Americans across the country. The case for reparations is about more than money. It's about justice, healing, and the promise of equality that America has yet to fulfill. Supporters argue that reparations are a necessary step toward closing the wealth gap and breaking the cycle of poverty that began with slavery. Critics challenge the cost and implementation, but what remains undeniable is the need to address the harm that was done. So, where does that leave us? Are reparations the answer to centuries of injustice? Or is there another path to reconciliation? Whatever the solution, one thing is clear. The legacy of slavery is not confined to the past. It lives on in the present, and until it is confronted, the future remains uncertain. So, Where does this all leave us? Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We've explored the history of reparations, starting with the unfulfilled promise of 40 acres and a mule. We've seen how systemic inequality, rooted in slavery, continues to reverberate today through generational wealth gaps, disparities in education, housing, healthcare, and the struggles of countless African American families to build the futures they deserve. We've also examined the $350,000 reparations claim that set the internet on fire. Did Trump actually promise such a thing? The reality is more nuanced. Whether the statement was misinterpreted, exaggerated by media outlets, or manipulated for political gain, the truth remains elusive. What's clear is that the conversation about reparations is far from over, and its resolution will have lasting implications for the future of this nation. Even if such reparations were proposed, the cost, estimated at $14 trillion, raises enormous questions about feasibility. Could the government afford to pay such a sum? How would it impact the broader economy? And perhaps most crucially, what systems would need to change to ensure that reparations don't simply become a one-time payout, but instead provide lasting, meaningful change? These are critical questions. Yet beyond the numbers and politics, the debate about reparations touches on something deeper: justice. For supporters, reparations are not just about financial compensation. They're about acknowledging centuries of harm, about saying to African Americans, "We see you, we hear you, we recognize the suffering your ancestors endured and the obstacles you still face today." It's an attempt to honor the untold stories of resilience and to give due recognition to the injustice that has shaped African American lives for generations. On the other hand, critics often focus on the questions of cost, fairness, and practicality, issues that reflect the broader struggle America faces in confronting its own history. How do we measure the worth of something so vast, so deeply entrenched in society's structures? How do we balance the need for reparative justice with the practicalities of today's economic reality? These are valid concerns, but they also highlight the difficulty America has had in reckoning with its own legacy of oppression and inequality. This divide brings us to a fundamental question. What does justice look like for African Americans whose families lived through slavery, segregation, and systemic exclusion? Some believe reparations must take the form of direct financial payments, like the $350,000 figure that sparked so much debate. For them, it's a way to provide immediate relief and recognition for the generations of harm that have gone unaddressed. Others argue that true reparative justice means investing in Black communities through better education, affordable housing, healthcare, and policies that dismantle systemic racism. Perhaps it's not just about a check, but about creating pathways to opportunity that have been denied for far too long. Consider the stories we've shared. Individuals like Mary, who dreams of sending her children to college, but is trapped in a cycle of poverty created by forces beyond her control. Or James, whose family was denied the same benefits white veterans received after World War II, setting them back generations. These stories are not isolated. They reflect the collective experience of millions of African Americans who, despite everything, continue to persevere. Their resilience is a testament to the strength of a people who helped build this nation, but have yet to receive their due. Reparations, in whatever form they may take, are not just about righting the wrongs of the past. They are about creating a future where justice and opportunity are accessible to everyone, regardless of race or background. They're about providing the resources and opportunities that were stolen for generations, and ensuring that future generations have the chance to thrive. As we look ahead, the conversation around reparations is not going away. Whether Trump's statement was real, exaggerated, or fabricated, it has reignited a debate that America cannot afford to ignore. Reparations are about more than politics. They are about confronting hard truths. What is owed? And how can we begin to heal the deep, lasting wounds of systemic racism that continue to shape the lives of so many today? Please share your thoughts in the comment section. What do you believe justice should look like for the African American community, and how can we move toward a more equitable future?